See, okay, for the recording. So welcome to the Babyn Yar event. Dominique Arel, I'm chair of Ukrainian Studies here at the University of Ottawa. And we're delighted to host Professor Magocsi, chair of Ukrainian Studies from the other university, one of the other ones, University of Toronto, who is the constructor or conductor of this book, and co-editor of the book. And I'll be accompanied in the Q&A with my colleague, Yulia Yurchuk, who's from the University of Soderton in Sweden. And she arrived today, not just for this event. We have a big one, a 3-day conference starting tomorrow. And Yulia has written a great deal, going back to her dissertation days on historical memory and in Ukraine, World War II, and so forth. Originally, Daria Mattingly was supposed to be the co-moderator. And she, because of health issues, she couldn't travel from London, from the UK. So Yulia gracefully accepted at the last minute to step in for the conversation. So this will be, this is an event, I should add, that is co-sponsored by the Ukrainian-Canadian Congress, Ottawa chapter, and as Professor Magocsi will explain, comes out of the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter Initiative, which is a civil organization here in Canada, whose mission is to bring kind of a rapprochement and between communities, in particular Jewish and Ukrainian communities, over an understanding of memories and history in Ukraine. This is the week of commemoration of this gruesome event that took place 83 years ago in Kiev, Babyn Yar, which is why it's being held tonight. So without further ado, maybe I will ask Professor Magocsi just to give us some background about how the project came about before we get into substance, the specifics. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, dear colleague. I remember when our colleague always used to introduce me, because this is not the first time we've operated together. He would say that, well, he's the kind of junior and I'm the senior, because the chair of Ukrainian Studies was in fact founded a little bit before his chair. But now, considering the fact that we have both moved on in age, it's difficult to refer to yourself as terribly much junior than me. But in age, you probably still are, and I guess will always be. First of all, thank you very much for, now I'm speaking on behalf of the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter, a nonprofit organization which we just heard alluded to, based in Toronto, and has been in existence for at least 15 years. My dates or my memory is not always so great on such things. Well, I happen to be a member of the board of directors of that institution. And among the products that Ukrainian Jewish Encounter has created is this this book called Babyn Yar. And on behalf of the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter, I would actually like to thank Dominique Professor Arel personally for making it possible to hold this event on the eve of a 3-day conference, which he and his colleagues have a little bit few other things on their mind. So we're taking that into account and do appreciate the invitation and allowing us to conduct this discussion on the eve of the important Danilev seminar that has been going on for at least a decade, if not longer, and thanks to the personal and always strong intervention of Professor Arel. So again, thank you very much for allowing us to be here, and also some of your colleagues from that the seminar are with us in the audience. In answer to the question that Professor Arel put forth, ever so slightly, a little bit of context of how this particular project and this book came about, not realizing that we're on the cusp of another anniversary of a terribly tragic event in the 20th century. As always, one has to be reminded that the 20th century is the worst period or worst century in human history, in which humanity became professionalized murderers of each other. We don't have to go into the numerous examples of that dastardly aspect of humanity, one of which, of course, was the Holocaust during World War II. For the 75th anniversary of the specific events that took place in Kiev after the Nazi German invasion of the Soviet Union, at its 75th anniversary, our organization, the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter, at least 2 years before, thought it would be appropriate to do something special on the 75th anniversary. Some large-scale, it turned out to be a very large-scale, 1-week-long commemorative event that took place in Kiev, culminating on September 29th and September 30th, which would have been 2016. And in the context of this week-long series of commemorations, which included scholarly conferences, programs for youth from all over Ukraine, an international competition for a landschaft design for Babyn Yar, still not yet realized, like many things. We also, and also a large-scale commemorative concert in the opera. We also prepared for that commemorative week 2 publications. One publication was a more popular introductory volume written by myself in cooperation with my colleague Johann Petrovsky Stern, called Jews and Ukrainians, A Millennium of Coexistence. That volume actually is available for, I believe, for any of you who may be interested in it. I mean, available here. And the other volume was a more scholarly tome based on solicitation of several authors to write on subjects that were pre-prepared, so to speak. We created a book with a certain number of chapters, and a first version of it appeared both in English and in Ukrainian for this event back in 2016. It was created specifically for the event, so it had to be done relatively quickly so that it would be ready, and it was ready in both languages. And then since that time, we decided to do a scholarly version of the book with all the appropriate scholarly apparatus, changes that needed to be necessary in the existing texts, added a few more chapters. And so that's, in a sense, briefly, as I've been always asked to speak briefly, and notice it's probably not as brief as it could be, but nonetheless, the context of this volume.
Now, yes. Maybe I can just ask about the context a bit more, because you were writing this book, even the first version in Ukrainian 2016, already after the annexation of Crimea and already when the war was going on in the eastern part of Ukraine. So how it influenced your history writing and the project, and then this book came 2023 after the full-scale invasion. So how this big war influenced the history writing again? Would you see the differences, these influences, if they were there?
Well, first of all, as you well know, and everyone knows here, because the vast majority of the audience here are scholars at various levels of their career, scholarly projects are long in the making, number one. And so the very idea for this book, and now it's interesting that you say that, because I did say it started 2 years in advance, and I can't remember now of whether we had this discussion before or after February of 2014. And I believe it was just before, in which we sketched out effectively a monograph. So that process probably began in December, if I remember, because for some reason I was in Kiev in December of 2013. But I guess, to make a long story short, the first phase of the war and the second phase of the war I don't think did, nor should have any influence over a scholarly project that is dealing with events that happened 75 years before. In general, as scholars and academics, we should avoid being influenced by what's going on us at any time, positive or negative. So, no, I think our approach, our understanding was influenced either by the first phase in February 2014 or by the second phase in 2022. I don't think it was influenced, and I'm glad that it wasn't, because it shouldn't have been.
I was a graduate student at a summer school in 1991. It's a long time ago. And that was actually a few weeks before the failed putsch of August 1991. And that's when we were at the school. George H.W. Bush, then President of the United States, the father Bush, came to Kiev. It's the infamous Chicken Kiev speech, but that's not what I want to talk about. He has a very short, the visit was not even 24 hours, like early afternoon, and then made the speech, and then off he goes, but it was the first time, obviously, that the United States president would go and visit Ukraine that was in the midst now of, though we didn't fully realize it at the time, separating from Moscow. But what was striking, because this is a book about history and this is a book about memory, about how to remember history, is that the one public event before the speech was the commemoration at Babyn Yar. And I remember the very young director of the school, Ukrainian, he couldn't quite understand so why this, and then the speech, and then off he goes. And of course, if we fast forward, now the ceremony is that if you have guests like this, well, they go to the Holodomor memorial, or now after 22, even Bucha, that decides memory, but not Babyn Yar, except for the annual commemoration and at this time of the year. So my question to you, since you've been involved in this project, is how did this memory of Babyn Yar evolve even since Ukraine has become or was on the cusp of independence and then has evolved to this day? There's a longer history that is better known as basically the Soviet from 1943 or 1944 stopped referring to the Jews altogether. It was Soviet citizens being murdered in Babyn Yar, so silencing the Jewish component of Babyn Yar. So that's how did, in being involved in the project, and the book went through various phases, even in publications from Ukrainian to English. What did you learn, in a sense, in terms of this complex memory of Babyn Yar?
You want the short end answer? The short end answer, as often is the case, studying history, well, for you as a political scientist, maybe it's not so radical, but studying history, we all study history and we all say, well, let's study history because we're going to, if you'll never be able to avoid mistakes in the future if you don't know what the past was like, as if studying the past is going to help you avoid mistakes. In fact, what has happened is that we study the past and we make the same mistakes, we just make them worse. So the value of history here, coming from a historian who's been practicing it forever, is not as an instructive element, but it is an exercise in creating memories for those who don't have those memories, because history by its very nature is created by historians. They use some facts, but in fact, it's their creation. So I thought you were going somewhere else with your question. So let me respond, and then you'll tell me if you need me to follow up. You began by speaking about the 1991, and before that speech was, when did Bush go there? It was 89, I think, wasn't it? Or was it 90? It was 91. Yeah, okay, fine. All right, so fine. We have the speech, and then we have independence and so forth and so on. And I thought you were going in the direction, events like, because I was saying we as scholars shouldn't be affected by the present. Well, it depends on what is going on in the present. Ukraine becoming an independent state, that's going to affect everybody. Well, it affects everybody, including intellectuals, including scholars, including historians, who had a fixed image of what reality was until the collapse of the Soviet Union. And as a result of that, that had a profound impact on all of us. We had to rethink everything. Fortunately for me, it was teaching already the history of Ukraine. It was wonderful because I always treated Ukraine as a complete and distinct entity anyway. But even the manner in which we were then going to look and understand inevitably is influenced by what we know now, and the independent state of Ukraine gives us a different view of how to look at the historical past than before. So that's inevitable. I thought you were going in that direction. As for a good portion of this present book, reflecting the title, History and Memory, deals with memory as how an event has been remembered in various forms, as you can see from the chapters. Individuals' memory, literary works, artistic works, cinema, music. That's one thing. And then there's the commemoration process, building statues and monuments, etc. And we all know that that is one of the most challenging things for any society. Oh, what kind of monument, what kind of commemoration is appropriate to remember some event? And there's controversy almost always, regardless of what kind of event, regardless of what country, unless you're living in a totalitarian environment in which say, we're going to do this and end of discussion. If you're not in that, as you well know, there's always struggle about how to commemorate things. And then, as we also well know, could be 10 years later, 15 years, 20 years later, then we're tearing it down because it's no longer appropriate. And in the case of now Babyn Yar, ever since Ukraine's independence, it's taken on a different hue or light in the sense that Ukraine, as an independent state, from the very beginning, on the one hand, in pure political terms, was a rejection of Soviet totalitarian rule or authoritarian rule, minimally. And on the other, it was an expression of Ukrainian patriotism, some might say nationalism, in which almost from the very beginning, and we saw this in a movement that was very strongly behind Ukrainian independence, the Ruch movement, that Ukraine, this independent state of Ukraine, was a state not only of ethnic Ukrainians, but of all Ukrainians. This may sound like, why ethnic Ukrainians and all Ukrainians? Because everybody is a Ukrainian if you live in Ukraine and born in Ukraine, regardless of what your ethnic background is. And the kind of liberal humanitarian thrust behind the Ukrainian, at that time, national movement that was behind this state was then enshrined in the Constitution, recognizing that Ukraine is a country of all peoples. That's what it means to be a Ukrainian. In that context, that had a very important impact on the status of other peoples living in Ukraine who were not of ethnic Ukrainian ancestry, but were still Ukrainians anyway. And that included Jews. And so the whole attitude toward not only the evolution of Jewry in independent Ukraine, which flourished certainly in the 90s and early 21st century until the present war, but also the question of commemoration. The first president of Ukraine, Kravchuk, spoke openly about the need to remember properly what took place at Babyn Yar in late September 1941. And the government then got involved. Of course, as we well know, when the governments get involved and for commemoration and not being a totalitarian government and simply being able to say, this is what we're going to do, and that's it, and then start building. No, we have to consult with society. And the moment you start doing that, then all of the debates arises. how we're going to commemorate it, what should be there, and so forth and so on. And that is discussed at some length in this book. All of the debates about commemoration up until 2016, and then an addendum at the end as to what has been taking place since 2016 up until the present.
I would like to continue a bit on this commemoration and memory, and maybe not speak a lot about these ethnic tensions, but about the tensions between private and public sector, because I think that here we can see maybe the main conflict, because right now, because of the war, a lot has changed, exactly how, as you write in your afterword. And just recently I read an article that all the archives of Memorial Center Babyn Yar were removed from Ukraine. So they were taken somewhere else. And this is both about history and about memory, right? And because this is the private actor, they can do it. But the memory and commemoration is not private, right? And this is a very loaded public interest there. So how do you see this tension, and what can be the solution? Because I think that when we speak about this commemorative space, it's very often not about like ethnic tensions, it's about all this interest, public and private.
Before I comment on the public and private, you hit the nail on the head, as one can say. Let me be clear, I don't think I have made any reference to ethnic tensions in my comments when we were talking about the commemoration business, and certainly not during the period of independent Ukraine, where precisely because of what I said about the attitude of the Ukrainian national movement that in the end contributed toward the creation of an independent Ukraine, remarkably, there are little or no ethnic tensions in Ukraine. That might exist in the diaspora. That's a different story. Fortunately, Ukraine has gotten over that. But now to your question of the public and private spaces, or the government and private. Ukraine, as a state, ever since its foundation, made various declarations inspired by a humanistic, liberal philosophy. And that included recognition, tolerance for all the peoples who live on the territory of Ukraine, whether they be people of Polish ancestry or Crimean Tatar ancestry, or of Mennonite and German ancestry, Romanian, Moldovan, even Hungarian. Actually, I should say Hungarian as well. The Russian thing was a little bit complex, but certainly welcomed all kinds of activity that would help preserve the cultures and respect for the cultures and ancestral heritage of these various peoples. But Ukraine never had any money. And so, yes, they can make all these declarations for, oh, yes, it's great to have this kind of organization, that kind of organization, this kind of publication, et cetera, et cetera. Perhaps the only kind of money that they gave indirectly was to state television that in certain local areas would have programs devoted to a particular cultural area. But the rest, they don't have money for anything. They don't even have money to support their own ethnic Ukrainian activities. So it's kind of equal discrimination on the one hand, or equal lack of funds for anything. However, we're open to the outside world. And if some groups have friends in the outside world or diaspora members, if the Mennonites want to reconstruct the island of Chortica where they had buildings, let them do it. If the Polish government wants to reinvigorate Likachiv Cemetery and Polish monuments to their struggle for Lviv, let them do it. If the Hungarian government wants to give money for schools for their minority in Transcarpathia, let them do it. And if Jewish organizations, wherever they may be, want to give support to this wide range of Jewish cultural organizations, schools, religious schools, Hebrew schools, fine, let them do it. And this is what's happened. Many of these activities that are somehow related to the various peoples that comprise Ukraine as a result of this attitude. Crimean Tatars want to come home to Crimea, let them come. But we don't have enough money to pay for their resettlement. And so, fine, they can come back, and they should come back, but they're going to have to live in whatever they have, a container that they brought their stuff in, and we know all of that. And this is not being negative, just Ukraine didn't have the means, purely and simply. And so the possibility to get outside support, including for commemorational activity that is related to the state as a whole. For instance, the Holodomor monument, right? Seek money from the outside, if possible. And they're still doing it. So it's in this context that the public sphere, the private sphere, which is usually funding can be from organizations, but it also can be from very wealthy individuals that now get involved in commemorating things in another country in which technically the state should be making the decisions, but in a kind of free-for-all environment. If the money comes, okay, they want to do it, please be my guest. We'll pass some kind of decree or some kind of law, presidential statement, and so forth and so on. And this is what's happened with the Babyn Yar business. External funding came in incredibly large amounts. Namely, the private sphere was now impinging on the public sphere. And if that private sphere happened to be coming from outside Ukraine, and almost always it didn't make a difference whatever these groups were, whether it's the Hungarian government or the Polish government or for their peoples, this then became a very serious issue and a very serious problem.
So we know now from...
Unresolved to this day.
So historical research has advanced a great deal since the opening up of archives after the collapse of the Soviet Union, particularly in the last 10, 15, 20 years. We have a better understanding on the different phases of the Holocaust, the Shoah. Auschwitz-Birkenau, of course, is the ultimate symbol of the cataclysm of the Holocaust. But there was actually the second phase, industrial killing in death camps. And as became clearer, there's a French priest that popularized the term, Patrick Desbois, and the Shoah par balle, the Holocaust by bullets. That's the not only massacres, but like systematic killing of Jews on site, and much of it in Ukraine in 1941, early 1942, and after it moved to this second phase. Babyn Yar then symbolized, Babyn Yar, sorry, Babyn Yar is the Russian version linguistically, symbolizes this initial phase of the Holocaust as such. You know, past the pogroms here, it's like systematic killing. It was building up in the summer of 1941 in Ukraine. But Babyn Yar, since the Germans counted the dead, it seems, to the last person, was nearly 35,000 people shot within 2 days, which is most probably the single largest massacre of the Holocaust on site in World War II. So we have like Babyn Yar symbolizing Holocaust Part 1, and then Auschwitz-Birkenau symbolizes Holocaust Part 2. In other words, this very potent symbol, it happened in the capital of what was then Soviet Ukraine, is now independent Ukraine. But after the massacre and the following years during German occupation, Babyn Yar, this huge ravine, became some sort of dumping grounds for a lot of people. The numbers are unknown, and according to the historical research that we have in the book, Nachmanovich in particular, but it may have been in the tens of thousands of people, prisoners of wars, mentally ill people, Ukrainian nationalists in terms of members of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, that organization, and other civilians were murdered by the Nazis. And the question in terms of how to memorialize Babyn Yar once Ukraine became independent, because there was no memory before, and the Soviet Union is just radio silence, zero memory, is how then you memorialize this enormous event that took place in late September 41, and at the same time, this site of killing, this killing fields that went on for a couple of years. And as the book in some chapters show, that has divided, well, people in Ukraine and internationally involved in the memorialization of Babyn Yar, most likely to this day. Would you want to say a word about this, probably one of the points of contention about not what happened, but what to make of it, how to memorialize it?
First of all, you're absolutely correct. And it goes back to the point that I was making. In the absence of funding and the state taking hold and direction of memorialization in the first years, in the 1990s, various groups simply decided to put up monuments, just simply went to Babyn Yar. So there was a little monument to Ukrainian nationalists. Olena Teliha was one of them, and then even named the street for her, but there's a little monument. Then the Roma came, and they had a little monument, and then they had a wagon, symbolic of the nomadism of at least one component of the Roma population. The Orthodox built a chapel because ostensibly 1 or 2 priests were killed. There was a monument, and there is a monument to prisoners of war, because one of the largest components of deaths in Babyn Yar was at the Siritz camp that was for primarily German prisoners of war. Let's be precise. Prisoners of war serving in the Wehrmacht. They could be Germans, they could be Alsatians, they could be Czechs, whomever else that the German army corralled into the Wehrmacht and then sent east. But be that as it may. And so you had this kind of kaleidoscope of monuments. Jews had one but didn't have one. Namely, under the Soviets, they built one but didn't mention Jews, but now they changed plaques, and so they were mentioned. So the point was, in a sense, there was anarchy. And sometimes, and very often, monuments are being put on ground where dead people were, with no either knowledge or attention given to that. And so 2016 was a key year because the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter, which was the first one to decide to commemorate the 75th anniversary, starting way back in 2014, had as one of its main components, as I said, this international competition, architectural competition for Landschaft design, run under the auspices of the International Association of Architects in Paris. And the whole point of it is to, here are possible ways to commemorate this land. Of course, the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter couldn't do it, the costs involved, but this is one way of doing it. And then the Ukrainian government also realized that, well, you know, this is an important matter. Clearly there is external interest, then maybe we should do something. So they passed decrees, they set up a commission, they engaged the Institute of History of the Institute of Ukrainian History of the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences to come up with ideas of how to commemorate this area. And then arose another project led by 4 what we would call oligarchs. 3 of them technically all born in Ukraine, but long gone or made their financial careers elsewhere. 3 of the 4. One of the 4 was in Ukraine. The other 3, whether residing in London or Moscow, clearly their funding was based on the Russian economy. And they came in with very big bucks, very big money. And they did 2 things. One thing is that they tried to systematically supply funding for scholarly research. Brought together a series of serious scholars. In fact, the head of the head advisor of this program for historical research was my former graduate student from the Netherlands, Karel Berkhoff. And they began to do good, solid archival research. So that was one component. The other component, however, was what to do on the territory of Babyn Yar itself. And so this raised the issue of museums, which naturally, almost normally for something like this. But museum of what? Museum just of the events that occurred in September 1941? Or a museum devoted to just the Holocaust? Or a museum devoted to the evolution of Jewry on the territory of Ukraine, and not only. So this is these kind of debates which went on and ended in a kind of standoff between this privately funded, well-endowed or well-funded project on the one hand, led by, some people don't like it, but for all intents and purposes, Russian oligarchs, versus a project that was proposed at the request of the Ukrainian government by the Academy of Sciences, the Institute of Ukrainian History, the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences. So you had this dichotomy between the two, unresolved. The government, like always, playing it both ways. Oh, well, you know, we don't have any money. We can't do this. So if we're going to get money, fine, let's support that project. At the same time, calling on their own historical institute to come up with ideas. So already the government is neither one nor the other. And then, of course, came the second phase of the war in February 2022, and everything ended, period. And so that's where we are today.
Yes, the future is unclear, of course, but I just wanted to come back to history. And you start your book not really like with Babyn Yar as a place of Holocaust. For those of you who didn't read it, it starts from basically Kiev Rus, pre-Christian period. So if you read, it's really a very long history. So I just wanted to ask you how you decided how to start, because you start like before even Babyn Yar was what we know, and then you start Babyn Yar after Babyn Yar. So how you came with this idea?
This book came about way back in 2013, first version 2016, second, third version, I don't know, 2022. So it's at least now, in my mind, 3-4 years old minimally. And I can't remember anything because I have a condition. It's getting serious, and you should be sympathetic to me. It's a condition called OS. Have you ever heard of OS? It's, you know, it's quite serious and it creeps up on you and it gets stronger and stronger. It's called old school. And so operating system. And the operating system is old school. The point is I'm coming on the train. Since I'm old school, I didn't fly. I came by train from Toronto. I thought I was going to get a good lunch, but I didn't. I got a lousy breakfast. But be that as it may, I took this book, Babyn Yar, and I read the introduction, I read some chapters on the way. It's not a bad book, actually. But what's my point? My point is, you know what struck me? It's an encyclopedia. To your point, it's an encyclopedia about a place called Babyn Yar. And since it's a place, then we need to know everything about that place before it became infamous, and after it, and the infamy, of course, and then after. That's how we conceived it. And so you're absolutely correct. The first chapter begins with not only Kiev and the Rus, even prehistory. The person whom we got to write it is a specialist in geology, by the way. So we have the description, and which is also important. You have to know what literally the lay of the land is to then understand subsequent events that took place on it. And so that was the plan from the very beginning. That it is a compendium, almost encyclopedic, about a specific place in which it does deal substantively with those events that made the place most infamous. So that's how I would answer that.
Yeah, and it really gives a very long history and deep understanding of the place. So for those of you who didn't read it, so please read.
Yulia mentioned the practical problems, the displacement of archives since February 22 to protect them from literally destruction, bombing. But beyond the practicality of where the archives are and how unsafe it is actually to go to Ukraine and work and, you know, try to do quote unquote normal work in completely abnormal situations. We have the reality of a full-scale, high-intensity war for 2.5 years. We have the absurdity of a state and a president calling this war, which is not a war, according to Russia, an operation for the denazification of Ukraine. An absolute absurdity, and yet constantly hammered, and for anyone who not really follow Russian TV, but follow people who actually take upon themselves to watch Russian TV on a daily basis, the propaganda has been relentless, basically dehumanizing the Ukrainians. In these charged and emotionally extremely difficult, well, not just emotionally, but very difficult conditions, extreme conditions, how can we conduct actually historical research or even reflect about the history, and in particular of World War II, because of how against the war of aggression is actually called in Russia constantly, again, in the daily propaganda? Is it even possible to engage in that, well, to engage in historical research or to have debates about the commemoration of events, which normally is done and has been done actually in Ukraine and in Ukrainian studies quite a bit in the last 10, 15, and 20 years. But now the times are abnormal. So my question to you is how to cope with history and memory in the conditions that Ukraine has been under and with no end in sight.
Basic thrust of your question is how to cope in present circumstances in terms of practical work. And I will address
practical, but also I would say almost emotional.
And I am going to continue with that. So, in many ways, scholarly research on many issues, not just simply World War II, and in terms of archival research, access thing, in many ways has to be put on hold. There's a war going on. It's quite natural that it is going to be put on hold, but being put on hold is not necessarily meaning that it's going to go away. There will be opportunity. Again, the very fact that at least some archives and some libraries are being removed already is a mark of insight as to what needs to be done, because, okay, we can't do so much now, there's a war going on, but the war is not going to go on forever. The other question is, to my mind, a much more tricky one, and it's a one that always bothers me. What are we doing as intellectuals and historians, burying ourselves in issues of the past that for all intents and purposes have little relevance for the dying soldiers on the front and the bombs falling on houses. And we're concerned about events that happened 75 years ago or 100 years ago or whatever. Sometimes I get this feeling that this is immoral. Well, this summer, I posed that question to a Ukrainian audience. And an audience of the most influential kind. The most influential audience in any society are teachers. And I don't mean us. We write scholarly books that very few people read. We don't, as much as we think, we don't have that much influence over society as a whole. But people who write textbooks and the teachers who use them in elementary schools and high schools, these are the people that have an impact on society. And so every year, within the framework of a program that began and still is to a large extent, focusing on how to teach the Holodomor in Ukrainian schools, that every year there's a 2-week seminar in which, run by a well-known scholar of the Holodomor, Lyudmila Hrenevich in Kiev, under the auspices of the Ministry of Education, and there's always a representative of them. And they bring about 20 teachers and school directors from all over Ukraine, and they have 2 weeks of discussion. Well, it used to be in Mykolaiv. You can't do it in Mykolaiv anymore for obvious reasons, but they've still been doing it for the last 3 years. And of course, I guess those of you in Ukrainian studies all know where it takes place now. Even though you're bringing people from all over Ukraine, it takes place in the only place it can take place in Ukraine, and that is in Transcarpathia, the only safe place. So be that as it may, we have all of these issues. And the last 3 times I was there, and this time I literally posed the question, almost like I just did now. Do we have a moral right to be interested in these things right now? There's a war going on. And some of those people sitting in the audience actually are soldiers, former soldiers from the front, who are teachers and now off. You know what their response was? You must continue to do this. We need this information. We will always need correct information. We have to deal with young people. We are creating the new generations. I didn't feel as bad since then.
And now it's time to open the floor to the audience. And we have already Anna. Yes.
Maybe that one over there.
Thank you. So my question is about the construction of like the last years of when Babyn Yar construction was taking place, and it was taken. The director of that whole thing was Ilya Khrzhanovsky, who is a very controversial director of movies in Ukraine, but also he is infamous for his political views. So he is. He said many times that he considers Ukrainians Nazis, and the project also had financial ties to Mikhail Friedman, an oligarch from Russia, and Ilya Khrzhanovsky, he kind of post-dated his departure from the project already in 2023, I think. He said that I have left previous summer, and like I have no opportunity to continue it because I live in Germany, I don't live in Ukraine. But given his financial ties of this project to Russia, it was in the media in Ukraine, it was a discussion of how could he do it to begin with. And my question is, do you think that his personality and his like the way the project was funded at the time, do you think it has impacted how it was going on? And if yes, then in what way?
And the director that you're referring to is Krzyżanowski. Yeah, yeah. Well, my view is very clear on this matter, and it is spelled out in this, in lieu of a, I don't even know what it's called, the last chapter of this book. In lieu of an afterword, that's what it's called. First of all, I only use the term the Russian project. I feel totally opposed to the Russian project from the very beginning, being financed by people, and the main financer sits around the table with Putin. And most recently, as I guess you know, has simply declared that, went back to Moscow, by the way. Friedman. These are the people who were behind that. Unfortunately, the Ukrainian government played along with them, including Zelensky, because there was Zelensky before February 2022 and Zelensky after 2022. Of course, everything is on hold, but so much has now come to light that when it's not on hold anymore, and we're going to get back to the discussion of how to commemorate Babyn Yar, I can't imagine that anyone is going to have anything to do with that project, which still is around. To what degree it's still around, I don't know. And that Krzyżanowski said, oh, I'm not having anything to do with this project anymore. Karol Berkov did it even earlier, by the way, the head of the historical advisor said, this project that I got involved in is totally incorrect. I don't want to have anything to do with it publicly. Now we have Krzyżanowski. So I can't see this project. I can't see that project going forward. Unless for some crazy reason, a future Ukrainian government says, yeah, okay, we'll take the money. But I don't see any future for it, is my answer.
Thank you. We have another question here.
Thanks. Two quick questions and a quick point. First question, has there been any reaction from the Russian academic world to your book? Any reviews, any comments?
Do not know the answer to the question. Yeah. I think not.
Okay.
But I don't know. Oh, wait a minute. There may have been a review in Russian review. I can't remember. But pardon. What you mean is from people in the Russian Federation. Answer,
exactly.
Yeah. The answer, I have no idea. Don't think so. Don't know.
Okay. Second question, in Ukraine, and I think you've partially answered it in some of your other statements, but is there an acceptance that Babyn Yar is part of Ukrainian history? Or is there a sort of psychological attempt to separate it from Ukrainian history and say, it's not really us, it was somebody else? Did it happen to somebody else? And third one, just very quickly to answer the question you raised about why do history now? Vladimir Putin told you why. Because he wants to destroy that history and he wants to destroy everything that's being done. One of the whole purposes of the war is to defend it and keep it alive.
Pardon. The first question I answered. The second question, sorry. What was the second question again? Yes. Okay. The trend in his Ukrainian historiography, and this was even before 2014, was for Ukrainian historians, at least represented through the Institute of Ukrainian History, the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences, planned to do a new multi-volume history of Ukraine. The first stage was to engage, solicit from various historians, primarily in Ukraine, but not only, to comment on what kind of new history should be. And so they ran for over a year in their official organ, the Ukrainski Historiczny Journal, a series of essays debating and talking about what a new history of Ukraine could be. And to put it in the most simplest terms, is the history of Ukraine the history of the ethnic Ukrainians as a people? Or is the history of Ukraine the history of a state on which numerous peoples have existed in the past and until the present, and certainly in the future? The multicultural approach. And we know that there are, in the English language, these two variants. Well, the Institute of Ukrainian History actually basically took the position that the history of Ukraine needs to be written from the perspective of all the cultures and all the peoples and all the events that have ever taken place on the territory of the history of Ukraine. And therefore, in this context, of course, Babyn Yar and the tragedy is part of Ukrainian history. Why? Because Jews living in Ukraine are Ukrainians, and they are part of Ukrainian history, just like Poles living in Ukraine are Ukrainians, because they are part of it. So that's the new approach. Thank God.
Thank you. Do we have more questions?
Question about the narrative that was produced under the auspices of Karel Berhoff by the historians working with him. I'm sure you've had a chance to look at it. It may not be fair to ask you the question just off now, but perhaps you do have some thoughts on them. Do you have any issues with that narrative?
Okay, first of all, I almost didn't hear much of what you said because remember, I have OS, and not only can I not remember things, almost by design, I can't see very well and can't hear very well, and I want to keep it that way. But so therefore, I have to ask you to speak a little louder. Now, I think what you were asking is about Karel Berhoff's views. No, okay, then you're going to have to repeat the question because I really didn't hear it.
This is Alti Rodal, also from the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter Initiative.
Yes, this is a colleague from the organization that is sponsoring this event. So this is between colleagues here, or organizational colleagues. Please, and louder.
Okay. Karel Berhoff led a team of historians, and they produced a narrative. I'm sure that you are interested in this narrative and you've had a chance to look at it. And I just said that to put you on the spot to remember what you read whenever you read it. But do you remember having any issues with that narrative?
to the best of my knowledge, my remembering such things, I don't think I had too much of an overwhelming issues regarding it. But what I remember, to be honest, is what I got, and I did get an earful from the one person who is a close friend and colleague of mine, Vladislav Hrnevich, the one person who was a member of the group in which Karel Berkov was the chief advisor, but he was also a member of the project for the put together by the Historical Institute of the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences. So he's the only one that was on both of these. And some people, of course, criticizing him for being in both and up. And his strong argument to me early on, by the way, no longer, but early on is, why am I making a dichotomy between, quote unquote, the Russian project and the Ukrainian project? Because his argument is that we in the Russian project and in that historical commission basically took the theses that were laid out in this book, Babyn Yar, in the first edition. So, you know, many on that commission recognized what was already being done in this book. So that's how I would answer the question. That's what I know. And so I can't remember and give you any strong or precise views about the actual report that Karel Berkov under his name or under his leadership prepared, because when I saw it, it was a long time ago. But according to people who were close to that report, co-authors of that report, plus co-authors of the Historical Institute one, didn't see so much difference between them. The issue was where was the funding coming from? And another very important issue, not only where was the funding coming from, but who had control. Control over the property, control over what was actually going to take place. Because the issue is, you know, in many societies, who pays for the orchestra decides on what kind of dance. And this was really the serious issue.
And Karel Berkov left the project because of he didn't like the commemorational part, because it was unethical in his eyes.
Absolutely. I mean, you know, how can one react to the proposals of Krzyżanowski, right? I mean, any normal person says, what is this? And we know there's all these articles that he was trying to transform Babyn Yar into a Disneyland, basically, a Holocaust Disneyland.
I think
we have more questions. Do we have time?
It's just this conversation is a bit cryptic for most of the audience in terms of the narrative and basically what was the bone of contention. Does it have to do with the centrality of the Jewish experience in Babyn Yar as opposed to a multiplicity of
Maybe
tragedies?
we can explain to the
audience.
Yeah,
exactly, because I don't think most of us can follow here what's going on.
So this Babyn Yar narrative is available online, and it's standalone. And then there's the academic, like the academicians of Ukraine.
Louder, please.
Okay, so another concept for a narrative emerged, which was quite different. And we certainly can't go into details of this, but it was very different. And perhaps one way of explaining it is what has remained, at least until 2019. I don't know what happened afterwards. But as you enter the Babyn Yar Preserve, there's signage. And the first big sign tells you about the great cruelties and inhumanity of people killing each other and the great suffering, but it does not mention Jews. And we started this discussion with how Babyn Yar has become a symbol of the Holocaust by bullets. We don't like that epithet anymore because it's been overused and there's problems with it. But nonetheless, it is a symbol for so many that has been throughout the Soviet period, even at the time when it was being silenced. So the main thing I'm saying is that to this day, maybe, as I say, I don't know, it's 5 years now, the signage does not tell you that the largest proportion of the victims were Jews.
I'm the other Rodel. So good to see you, Dominique. Good to see you, Bob. Been too long. I bring regards from Karel Berkhoff. Aldi and I met with him not so long ago. And Karel is producing a major, and he believes might be definitive, account of the actual victims. And the numbers, he says, will be significantly lower than was believed, not of the night, but of the overall period. But the proportions will be more or less what they are now, Jews versus others. Just reporting that. And Bob, Karel wanted me to say hello to you.
I just want to go back to the explanation that Alti Rodal made, which wasn't really telling us about the actual report. What I was referring to of there not being much difference between the two based on the comments of a member of both of these projects was that intellectually and the historical record, there's not much difference. Commemoration is a different matter. How you commemorate, there was a difference between how commemorative things should happen. Let's not, talking about signage, I saw the signage, you saw the signage, someone else saw the signage, that it doesn't say, talk about Jews. Let's not leave this room and think that one of these projects is heavily commemorating Jews and the other one is not, because that would be a totally false dichotomy. So I just want to make that clear. There is the central feature of what took place in 1941, September 29, 30, is the destruction and murder of close to 34,000 Jews. That's the central feature of any kinds of commemorations that are being planned.
Yeah, I saw some hands there.
Thank you very much. Hello, thank you for tremendous work you've put into this particular piece. Also, by Googling you and other authors, it is notable the amount of work you've put into studying Ukraine and ethnic groups. And based on that, I have two questions. One question would be to you personally, because it was not necessarily easy to identify how do you yourself identify your background, your ethnic background, so on and so forth. And additional question to that would be your perception of Ukrainian government. Throughout this presentation, it was notable that quite a presence of critique towards Ukrainian government of all historic periods has been mentioned. And do you feel any moral responsibility for criticizing Ukrainian government right now, since the government is representing the people that are suffering because of Russian invasion, and whether that has any potential damage to the reputation of Ukraine, Ukrainian people, and the government and the state for such narratives?
I guess the answer to the first question is I don't think it's relevant at all in a scholarly discussion what the origin of somebody is. But then, of course, then one might think one is trying to hide something. So I'll just give you a very brief answer. I am born in the United States, so I am an American and a Canadian of Carpatho-Rusin and partially Hungarian ancestry. So that's that. Now, the second thing was a question or a comment?
It was a question. Do you feel any moral responsibility for criticizing Ukrainian government in the context of current war and institutional reputation of Ukrainian state?
Right. Well, I'm not aware of my criticizing the Ukrainian government here today. Maybe something that I said might have implied that. But being critical of any institution, and in this case, very specifically, the government of Ukraine during a period of war, anybody that might be critical doesn't mean just being critical in and of itself doesn't mean that they are opposed to Ukraine or opposed to what is going on. Criticism there's all kinds of criticism, as we know. There's criticism that is designed to be just purely negative and nothing else. And then there's criticism that's designed to be positive and helpful. So actually, I have no, to the best of my knowledge, at least, and it's difficult to see what I've written. You'd have to show. I don't think I've spoken out critically of the government of Ukraine at all. And during the period of war, not only do I not have any criticism of the government of Ukraine, I have the highest respect. And thank God that Ukraine has gotten, without, by chance, some guy who made his career as an actor, and now he's one of the greatest leaders. And if Ukraine didn't have him, things would be much different.
Thank you very much for clarifying. And just to follow up on my first question, I do appreciate you explaining your identity, so to say. I also noted that, to your point, it doesn't have any relation to today's presentation. That's absolutely valid. However, it was important for me to clarify where you yourself potentially come from and what kind of effect that could have on this particular piece that describes events that have happened on the Ukrainian territory. So thank you very much. Much appreciated.
I think we need to wrap up. Yeah. Raya, you want to say a word? Okay.
Yes, for those of you that I haven't met, I'm Raya Shadursky, and I'm the Director of Operations for the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter, UJE. And I just want to, on behalf of everyone here, of all our sponsors, to thank the three of you for a most enlightening and raising a lot of questions for us, particularly around the idea that history is very important. It's important in knowing your past, to remember it, to learn from it, and then commemorate it with dignity. Now, I want to also mention too that all the materials that are on the table back here, productions from UJE, are complimentary. Professor, are you available to sign any of the books if you want? So if any of you want him to sign any of the books, and also invite you to enjoy some of our light refreshments after this event. Thank you very much for coming and giving up of your time.
And thank you all for the wonderful questions. You are the ones that made this useful. Thank you.